Let us begin, not with a bang, but with a yawn. A great, cosmic, universe-encompassing yawn. Before everything you know and hold dear, before coffee, before taxes, before the exquisite awkwardness of a first date, there was Khaos. Now, don't get any grand ideas. Khaos wasn't some magnificent, bearded deity sitting on a throne of nothingness, stroking a cat made of antimatter. Nor was it, as your teenager's bedroom might suggest, a simple state of untidiness. No, this was a much more profound sort of mess. Think of it as the universe clearing its throat. A vast, empty, silent, and rather boring potential for everything, just waiting for someone to finally get things started. It was the cosmic equivalent of a blank page, and the author had a terrible case of writer's block. Out of this grand, gaping void, two things decided to emerge, mostly because there was nothing better to do. Erebos, who was darkness, and Nyks, who was night. Erebos was the kind of profound, deep space darkness that makes you feel small and insignificant, while Nyks was the more comforting, familiar darkness of a cozy bedroom just before you drift off to sleep. Being the only two entities in existence, they did what any two entities in a vast, empty void would do. They got together. It was less a passionate romance and more a cosmic inevitability. From this union of darkness and night, rather predictably, came Aether, the pure, shining light of the heavens, and Hemera, the day. So now we have a basic on-off switch for the universe. Light and dark, day and night. A good start, but still lacking a certain something. Like a place to stand. Khaos, seeing the progress and perhaps feeling a bit left out, decided to contribute a couple more things. It wasn't so much a creation as a cosmic sneeze, and out popped Gaia, the earth, and Tartaros, the deep, dark, rather unpleasant abyss beneath it. Gaia was the solid ground, the potential for mountains and valleys, the very stuff you could build a world on. Tartaros was the place you'd end up if you fell through a crack in that world, and just kept on falling. It was the universe's basement, full of damp, despair, and probably a lot of cosmic spiders. These were the primordial beings. They weren't gods in the way we think of them, with personalities and a penchant for turning people into cows. They were the concepts themselves. Gaia was the earth. Nyks was the night. They were the building blocks, the fundamental ingredients of a universe that was still trying to figure out what it wanted to be when it grew up. Gaia, being the earth and all, was a nurturing sort. She looked around at the vast emptiness and thought, this needs a bit of decorating. So, all by herself, through a process we now call parthenogenesis, a fancy word for doing it yourself, she brought forth two sons. The first was Pontos, the sea, a vast, churning, and rather wet addition to the landscape. The second was Uranos, the sky. And Uranos was something special. He was a vast, starry blanket of a being, arching over Gaia in a way that was both protective and, as it turned out, a little too close for comfort. Uranos looked down upon his mother, Gaia, who was also, conveniently, the entire world, and he was smitten. He covered her completely, from her highest peaks to her deepest valleys. And when the sky covers the earth, something magical happens. Time begins. Not with a tick-tock, but with the slow, inexorable rhythm of creation. The cosmic writer's block was finally over. The story could begin. This union of sky and earth was, to put it mildly, fruitful. In fact, it was ridiculously productive. They had 12 children in quick succession, which, even for primordial beings, is a lot. These were the Titans, the second generation of divine beings, and they were a handsome, powerful bunch. There were 6 boys. Okeanos, the great river that encircled the world. Koios, the titan of intellect, or what passed for it in those early days. Krios, the titan of the constellations. Hyperion, the titan of light, not to be confused with Aether, who was more of a raw, elemental light. Iapetos, whose main claim to fame would be his troublesome sons. And finally, the youngest and most ambitious, Kronos. The girls were no less impressive. Thea, the Titaness of sight and shining things. Themis, the Titaness of divine law and order. Mnemosyne, the Titaness of memory, a very useful person to have around in a pre-literate society. Phoebe, the Titaness of prophecy. Tethys, a sea goddess who would later marry her brother Okeanos. Keeping it in the family was a big thing back then. And Rhea, the gentle and kind-hearted Titaness who would have the misfortune of marrying Kronos. Now, you might think that having 12 beautiful, powerful children would be enough for any parent. But Uranos and Gaia were just getting started. Their next batch of children, however, was different. First came the Kyklopes, or Cyclopes as you might know them. There were 3 of them: Brontes, thunder; Steropes, lightning; and Argesh, bright. They were giants, for one thing, and they each had a single, large, rather unnerving eye in the middle of their forehead. They were master craftsmen, able to forge incredible things, but they weren't exactly easy on the eyes. Ori, Uranos, who was the sky and therefore had a certain aesthetic standard to maintain, was not pleased. "My children should be perfect," he grumbled, looking down at the one-eyed giants. "They should be as flawless as the stars, as beautiful as the dawn." Gaia, being the earth, was more accepting. "There are children," she'd say. "They have their own unique talents." But Uranos wouldn't have it. He found them monstrous, an ugly stain on his perfect world. And then came the third set of triplets. If Uranos thought the Kyklopes were bad, he was in for a nasty shock. These were the Hekatonkheires, the 100-handed ones. Their names were Khaos, Gyges, and Aegean, and they were, without a doubt, the most terrifying beings yet created. Each of them had, as their name suggests, 100 arms and 50 heads. Imagine trying to have a family dinner with that. The sheer logistics of it are mind-boggling. They were immensely powerful, a chaotic whirlwind of flailing limbs and chattering heads. This was the last straw for Uranos. He looked at his monstrous offspring, the one-eyed giants and the 100-handed horrors, and he was filled with a mixture of fear and disgust. He couldn't bear the sight of them. So, he did what any loving father would do. He took them and shoved them back into Gaia. That's right. He pushed them deep into the earth, back into the womb from which they came, imprisoning them in the dark, cavernous depths of Tartaros. Gaia, the earth, groaned in agony. It was one thing to give birth to these creatures. It was another thing entirely to have them imprisoned within her, constantly writhing and struggling. The pain was immense, a deep, internal pressure that never ceased. She pleaded with Uranos, her son and husband, to release their children. But Uranos was adamant. He was the ruler of the universe, and he would not have his perfect sky sullied by such monstrosities. Gaia's love for her children turned to a slow-burning rage. Her pain festered, turning into a desire for revenge. She couldn't act against Uranos herself. He was too powerful, too vast. But she had other children, the Titans, her beautiful, perfect children. Surely one of them would be brave enough to stand up to their father. One evening, as the sun set and the stars began to glitter in Uranos's vast body, Gaia gathered her Titan children around her. She spoke to them of her pain, of the injustice done to their siblings, the Kyklopes and the Hekatonkheires. She spoke of Uranos's tyranny, his vanity, his cruelty. "My children," she said, her voice a low rumble that shook the very foundations of the world, "your father has become a despot. He has imprisoned your brothers in the darkness, and he causes me unending pain. Will one of you stand against him? Will one of you free your mother from this torment and your brothers from their prison?" The Titans looked at each other, their faces a mixture of fear and uncertainty. To challenge Uranos, the sky itself? It was unthinkable. He was their father, the king of the universe. Okeanos, the eldest, shifted uncomfortably. Koios looked down at his feet. Hyperion polished a stray sunbeam. None of them dared to speak. Gaia's heart sank. Were they all cowards? But then, a voice, cool and steady, broke the silence. "I will do it, Mother." It was Kronos, the youngest of the Titans. He was not the strongest nor the biggest, but he was the most ambitious, the most cunning. He looked at his mother, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. He saw not just a chance to end her suffering, but an opportunity. An opportunity to seize power for himself. Gaia's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and trepidation. She knew her youngest son was different from the others. There was a ruthlessness in him that both frightened and impressed her. She had her champion. "Then you shall have the means to do it," she said. From deep within herself, from the heart of the earth, she produced a new element, a hard, gray, unyielding metal. She fashioned it into a great, curved blade, a sickle. It was a tool of the harvest, but in Kronos' hands, it would become a weapon to reap the sky. She gave the sickle to Kronos and explained her plan. It was simple, brutal, and utterly effective. That night, when Uranos descended to embrace Gaia, as he did every night, Kronos would be waiting. He would lie in ambush, and when the moment was right, he would strike. The other Titans, seeing Kronos' resolve, agreed to help. They would hold their father down, pinning the great sky to the earth, while Kronos did the deed. All except Okeanos, who, being a bit of a traditionalist, wanted no part in this celestial patricide. That night, as the stars twinkled in blissful ignorance, Uranos descended. He was filled with his usual desire, his mind on nothing but the pleasure of his union with the earth. He did not see his sons hiding in the shadows. He did not see Kronos, his youngest, clutching the great, gray sickle, as he lay upon Gaia. His 4 sons, Koios, Krios, Hyperion, and Iapetos, sprang from their hiding places at the 4 corners of the world. They seized their father, holding him fast. Uranos roared in surprise and outrage, but he was held tight. The sky was pinned to the earth, and then came Kronos. He emerged from the shadows, the great sickle gleaming in the starlight. With a single, mighty swing, he brought the blade down and castrated his father. He severed the connection between sky and earth, between creator and creation. The act was done. Uranos shrieked, a sound that echoed through the cosmos, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. He pulled away from Gaia, rising high into the heavens, never to touch the earth again. The age of Uranos was over. The age of the Titans had begun. From the blood that fell from Uranos' wound and spattered upon the earth, 3 new sets of beings were born. The Uranes, or Furies, terrifying goddesses of vengeance with snakes for hair, who would pursue and punish the wicked. The Gigantes, a race of powerful giants who would one day challenge the gods. And the Melii, the gentle nymphs of the ash trees. Kronos, in his moment of triumph, took the severed members of his father and hurled them into the sea. As they drifted on the waves, they began to foam and churn. And from that sea foam, a new being arose. A being of such breathtaking beauty that the world held its breath. It was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and desire, born from violence and lust, a perfect paradox. She floated to the shore on a scallop shell, and where she stepped, flowers bloomed. Kronos now stood as the undisputed king of the universe. He had defeated his father, freed his mother, and seized the throne. His first act as king was to do absolutely nothing about his imprisoned brothers. That's right. After all that, after Gaia's pain and her pleas, Kronos decided that the Kyklopes and the Hekatonkheires were better off where they were. They were too powerful, too chaotic, too much of a threat to his newfound authority. So he left them to rot in Tartaros. Gaia was, to put it mildly, not happy. She had traded one tyrant for another. The seeds of another rebellion were already being sown. Kronos married his sister, Rhea, and together they ruled over a so-called golden age. It was a time of peace and prosperity, where the earth brought forth food in abundance, and no one had to work. But it was a peace built on a foundation of betrayal and fear. Kronos, having overthrown his own father, was haunted by a prophecy. A prophecy delivered by his dying father, Uranos, and his tormented mother, Gaia. It was a simple, chilling prediction that he, too, would be overthrown by one of his own children. This prophecy consumed him. He became paranoid, suspicious, seeing potential rivals in every shadow. And when Rhea gave birth to their first child, a beautiful goddess named Hestia, Kronos did something truly monstrous. He took the newborn baby from her mother's arms, opened his mouth wide, and swallowed her whole. Rhea was horrified, heartbroken. But what could she do? Kronos was the king. His word was law. And so, the pattern was set. One by one, as Rhea gave birth to her children, Kronos swallowed them. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. Hera, the goddess of marriage. Hades, the god of the underworld. Poseidon, the god of the sea. All of them consumed by their paranoid father, imprisoned not in the earth, but in the belly of the king of the universe. Rhea's sorrow turned to a quiet, desperate resolve. She could not bear to lose another child. When she became pregnant for the 6th time, she went to her mother, Gaia, for help. Gaia, who had never forgiven Kronos for his betrayal, was more than willing to assist. Together, they hatched a plan. Rhea traveled to the island of Crete, and in a deep, hidden cave on Mount Ida, she gave birth to her youngest son. His name was Zeus. She then took a large stone, wrapped it in swaddling clothes, and presented it to Kronos. Kronos, blinded by his paranoia and not exactly the most observant of fathers, didn't even notice the difference. He took the swaddled stone and swallowed it, thinking he had once again cheated fate. Meanwhile, the real Zeus was being raised in secret on Crete. He was cared for by nymphs, and his cradle was hung from a tree so that he was neither on the earth, nor in the sky, nor in the sea, hiding him from his father's notice. He was nursed by a goat named Amalthea, and his cries were drowned out by the Curetes, armored male dancers who clashed their spears and shields to create a constant din. Zeus grew to manhood with astonishing speed, his divine nature fueling his rapid development. He was strong, charismatic, and filled with a burning desire for justice. He learned of his father's tyranny, of his swallowed siblings, of the imprisoned Kyklopes and Hekatonkheires. He knew that it was his destiny to challenge Kronos and to bring a new order to the universe. When the time was right, Zeus, with the help of Gaia, concocted a plan to free his siblings. He disguised himself as a cupbearer and served his father a special mixture of wine and mustard. Kronos, who was not known for his discerning palate, drank it down without a second thought. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Kronos' stomach churned, and he began to vomit. First, he brought up the stone he had swallowed in Zeus's place. Then, one by one, in reverse order of their swallowing, he regurgitated his children. Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, all of them now fully grown and very, very angry. They emerged from their father's belly, not as helpless infants, but as powerful gods and goddesses, ready for a fight. They looked at their youngest brother, Zeus, the one who had saved them, and they hailed him as their leader. The war was about to begin. The Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the gods, was a war that would shake the cosmos to its foundations. For 10 long years, the two sides were locked in a brutal stalemate. The Titans, led by Kronos, fought from their stronghold on Mount Othrys. The new gods, the Olympians, as they would come to be called, fought from their fortress on Mount Olympus. The battles were epic. Mountains were thrown, seas boiled, and the sky itself seemed to scream in protest. But the Olympians had a secret weapon, or rather, several secret weapons. On the advice of Gaia, who was now firmly on Team Zeus, he journeyed down into the depths of Tartaros. He slew the monstrous guard, camp, and freed his long-lost uncles, the Kyklopes and the Hekatonkheires. They were eternally grateful. The Kyklopes, the master craftsmen, forged incredible weapons for the gods who had freed them. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt, a weapon of immense power. For Poseidon, they forged the trident, a spear that could shake the earth and command the seas. And for Hades, they made the helm of darkness, a cap that rendered its wearer invisible. The Hekatonkheires, the hundred-handed ones, joined the fight with a terrifying fury. They stood on the front lines, a whirlwind of destruction, each of them picking up and throwing 100 massive rocks at a time, burying the Titans under a constant avalanche of stone. The tide of the war turned. The Titans, who had ruled for an age, were overwhelmed. Kronos, the king who had swallowed his own children, was defeated. Zeus, with his mighty thunderbolt, cast his father and the other male Titans down into Tartaros, the very prison where Kronos had left his own brothers to rot. There, they were bound in chains, guarded for all eternity by the Hekatonkheires. A fitting, ironic end for the Titan king. The female Titans, who had not taken part in the fighting, were spared. Themis, Mnemosyne, and the others were allowed to live in peace. Atlas, one of the sons of Iapetos who had fought with the Titans, was given a special punishment. He was made to stand at the western edge of the world and hold up the sky on his shoulders, a task that was both a great honor and a terrible burden. And so, the age of the Titans ended, and the age of the Olympians began. Zeus, the young god who had been raised in secret, was now the king of the universe. He and his siblings, the 6 original Olympians, drew lots to divide the world among them. Zeus, as was his right as the leader, claimed the sky and the heavens as his domain. Poseidon, with his new trident, became the ruler of the seas. And Hades, the eldest brother, drew the short straw. He became the lord of the underworld, the king of the dead, a gloomy and thankless job. The 3 brothers had divided the world, but the earth, Gaia, was to be common ground, ruled by all of them, though in practice, Zeus's authority was supreme. The new gods made their home on Mount Olympus, a peak so high that it pierced the heavens. There, they built magnificent palaces and feasted on ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods, which made them immortal. This was the new order. The 3rd generation of gods, the Olympians, were in charge. They were a dysfunctional family, to be sure, full of rivalries, jealousies, and scandalous affairs. But they were also a family of immense power and creativity, and their stories, their triumphs, and their tragedies would shape the world for centuries to come. The age of myth had truly begun, and it was going to be a wild ride. Now, you might think that after a 10-year war that literally reshaped the cosmos, the new gods would be ready for a bit of peace and quiet. You would be wrong. The Olympians were, if anything, even more prone to drama than the Titans. They were a family, and like any family, they had their squabbles. Zeus, as the new king, was determined to establish his authority and create a stable, orderly universe. His first order of business was to get married. And his first wife was not, as you might expect, his sister Hera. No, Zeus's first wife was Metis, a wise and prudent Oceanid, a daughter of Okeanos. She was so wise, in fact, that she was destined to bear 2 children, a daughter, who would be as wise and strong as her father, and a son, who would be so powerful that he would one day overthrow Zeus himself. Zeus, who had clearly been paying attention during the whole Kronos swallowing his children fiasco, was not about to make the same mistake. But he also didn't want to just swallow his own child. That was so last generation. He needed a more elegant solution. So, he did what any reasonable, all-powerful god would do. He turned his wife into a fly and swallowed her. That's right. He sweet-talked Metis, praised her wisdom, and then, when she was feeling particularly pleased with herself, he devoured her. It was, in a twisted way, a sign of respect. He wanted to keep her wisdom inside him, a part of him forever. And as for the prophecy, well, he had neatly sidestepped it. Or so he thought. Sometime later, Zeus developed a splitting headache. Not just a regular, "I've been ruling the universe all day" headache, but a truly epic, world-shattering migraine. The pain was so intense that he roared in agony, and the whole of Olympus trembled. He begged his fellow gods to do something, anything, to relieve the pressure. Hephaestos, the god of the forge, the son of Hera, born, some say, out of her jealousy of Zeus's solo parenting, had an idea. He took his mightiest axe, and with a single, well-aimed blow, he split open Zeus's head, and from the gaping wound in the king of the god's skull, a new goddess sprang forth. She was fully grown, clad in shining armor, and she let out a mighty war cry that echoed through the heavens. This was Athena, the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and handicrafts. She was her father's daughter in every way, wise, strong, and fiercely independent. And because she had been born from Zeus's head, and not from a union with a wife, the prophecy of a son who would overthrow him was neatly avoided. Zeus had his cake, and ate it too. Or rather, he had his wife and ate her too, and got a daughter out of the deal. It was a win-win, really. Except for Metis, of course. With his authority firmly established and his headache cured, Zeus turned his attention to the rest of his family. He married his sister Hera, making her the queen of the gods. Their marriage was tumultuous, to say the least. Zeus was a serial philanderer, unable to resist the charms of goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women alike. Hera, the goddess of marriage and fidelity, was consumed by a jealous rage that would become the stuff of legend. She spent most of her time and energy tracking Zeus's lovers and tormenting their unfortunate offspring. It was a match made in heaven, if heaven is a place of constant bickering, infidelity, and revenge. Their children were a mixed bag. Ares, the god of war, was a brutal, bloodthirsty thug who reveled in the chaos of battle. He was not a strategist like Athena. He was the god of the wild, frenzied, and often pointless violence of war. He was not popular. Hebe, the goddess of youth, was a more pleasant addition to the family, serving as the cupbearer of the gods until she was replaced by a handsome Trojan prince. And Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, was a rather niche deity, but a very important one if you happen to be in labor. Hephaestos, the god of the forge, was another story. He was the only Olympian who was not physically perfect. He was born lame, with a club foot, and his mother, Hera, was so horrified by his imperfection that she threw him off Mount Olympus. He fell for a whole day before landing in the sea, where he was rescued and raised by the sea nymphs Thetis and Eurynomy. He grew up to be a master craftsman, the greatest artisan the world had ever known. He forged the thunderbolts of Zeus, the armor of Achilles, and all the magnificent palaces on Olympus. He eventually returned to his celestial home, but he never forgave his mother for her cruelty. He even got his revenge by building her a beautiful golden throne that, once she sat in it, she could not get out of. It took the combined efforts of all the gods to free her, and only after Hephaestus had extracted a number of concessions, including the hand of the most beautiful goddess in marriage, Aphrodite. Yes, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, born from the sea foam and the severed genitals of Uranos, was married to the lame, soot-covered god of the forge. It was a classic case of Beauty and the Beast, and it was a disaster. Aphrodite was not one for fidelity. She had numerous affairs, most notably with the handsome and brutal Ares. Their trysts were the scandal of Olympus. Hephaestus, being a clever and cunning god, eventually caught them in the act. He forged an invisible, unbreakable net and hung it over his bed. Then he pretended to leave for a trip. As soon as he was gone, Ares and Aphrodite jumped into bed, only to have the net fall and trap them in a very compromising position. Hephaestus then invited all the other gods to come and have a look. The gods roared with laughter at the sight of the two lovers, naked and entangled in the net. It was the ultimate divine humiliation. But it didn't stop Aphrodite or Ares. Their affair continued, and they had several children together, including Phobos, fear, and Deimos, terror, who would often accompany their father into battle, and Harmonia, harmony, a rather ironic name given her parentage. While Zeus was busy managing his dysfunctional family and having countless affairs, his brothers were ruling their own domains. Poseidon, the god of the sea, was a moody and tempestuous deity, much like the ocean he controlled. He was a restless god, always seeking to expand his power and influence. He had a long-standing rivalry with Athena over the city of Athens. They held a contest to see who could give the city the better gift. Poseidon struck the Acropolis with his trident, and a spring of salt water gushed forth. It was a powerful display, but not particularly useful. Athena, on the other hand, planted an olive tree. The olive tree provided food, oil, and wood. It was a much more practical gift, and the city was named Athens in her honor. Poseidon was not a gracious loser. He flooded the surrounding plains in a fit of pique. Poseidon was also responsible for creating the horse. He was trying to impress the goddess Demeter, who was not interested in his advances. To escape him, she turned herself into a mare and hid among a herd of horses. Poseidon, not to be outdone, turned himself into a stallion, and, well, you can guess the rest. The result of this rather unorthodox union was a magnificent, winged horse named Arion. Poseidon was also the father of the Kyklopes. Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant who would later have a very unfortunate encounter with Odysseus, Hades, the lord of the underworld, was a much more solitary and gloomy figure. He rarely left his subterranean kingdom, and he was not a popular god. People were so afraid of him that they wouldn't even say his name, referring to him instead as the Rich One, because all the precious metals and jewels of the earth were found in his domain. The underworld itself was a vast and complex place. It was divided into several regions. The Asphodel Meadows was a sort of limbo, where the souls of most people wandered aimlessly after death. Tartaros, as we know, was the deep pit where the Titans were imprisoned, and Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, was a paradise reserved for the heroic and the virtuous. The whole realm was bordered by 5 rivers: the Styx, the river of unbreakable oaths; the Acheron, the river of pain; the Cocytus, the river of wailing; the Phlegethon, the river of fire; and the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, whose waters would wipe away all memory of one's past life. Hades ruled his kingdom with a quiet and grim efficiency. He was not evil, just in charge of a very depressing place. His greatest desire was for a queen to share his throne. He set his sights on the beautiful Persephone, the daughter of his sister Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. One day, as Persephone was gathering flowers in a meadow, Hades burst forth from the earth in his golden chariot, seized the terrified goddess, and dragged her down to the underworld to be his bride. Demeter was devastated. She searched the entire world for her daughter, her grief so profound that she neglected her duties as the goddess of the harvest. The crops withered, the fields lay barren, and a great famine fell upon the earth. The mortals were starving, and their cries reached the ears of Zeus. He knew he had to do something. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, down to the underworld to command Hades to release Persephone. Hades, who was not one to defy a direct order from Zeus, agreed. But he was a cunning god. Before he let Persephone go, he offered her a pomegranate. Persephone, who had been refusing to eat or drink anything in her grief, was so hungry that she ate a few of the seeds. It was a fatal mistake. By eating the food of the underworld, she had bound herself to it. She could not leave forever, that a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld with her husband, Hades. For the rest of the year, she would be allowed to return to the world above and be with her mother. And so, the seasons were born. When Persephone is in the underworld, Demeter grieves, and the world is plunged into winter. But when Persephone returns, Demeter rejoices, and the earth blooms once more in the spring and summer. It's a beautiful, poetic explanation for the changing of the seasons, born from a story of abduction, grief, and a very tricky pomegranate. The other Olympians had their own stories, their own domains, their own dramas. Apollo, the son of Zeus and the Titaness Leto, was the god of music, poetry, prophecy, and the sun. He was the epitome of youthful beauty and talent, a golden boy who drove the chariot of the sun across the sky each day. His twin sister, Artemis, was the goddess of the hunt, the moon, and the wilderness. She was a fierce and independent goddess who shunned the company of men and roamed the forests with her band of huntresses. Their birth was a dramatic affair. Hera, in her usual jealous rage, had forbidden any land under the sun to give shelter to the pregnant Leto. Leto wandered the earth, in labor and in pain, until she finally found the floating island of Delos, which was not technically under the sun, as it was not anchored to the seabed. There, she gave birth to Artemis and then, with her newborn daughter's help, to Apollo. Artemis, a goddess of childbirth from the moment of her own birth. It's a strange and wonderful mythology, isn't it? Hermes, the son of Zeus and the nymph Maia, was the messenger of the gods, the god of travelers, merchants, and thieves. He was a precocious child. On the very day he was born, he snuck out of his cradle, stole a herd of cattle from his brother Apollo, invented the lyre from a tortoise shell, and then snuck back into his cradle, pretending to be an innocent newborn. When Apollo, furious at the theft, confronted him, the baby Hermes simply blinked his innocent eyes and played a tune on his new lyre. The music was so beautiful that Apollo's anger melted away, and he traded his entire herd of cattle for the instrument. It was the beginning of a beautiful, if slightly dysfunctional, friendship, and so, the Olympian family was complete. 12 gods and goddesses, ruling from their mountain home, each with their own personality, their own powers, and their own penchant for causing trouble. They were not perfect. They were vain, petty, and often cruel. But they were also passionate, creative, and intensely human. They were a reflection of the world they ruled, a world of beauty and brutality, of love and loss, of order and chaos. The stories of their interactions with each other and with the mortals who worshipped them would become the great tapestry of Greek mythology, a rich and vibrant collection of tales that have captivated and inspired humanity for thousands of years. And we've only just scratched the surface. The real fun is just beginning, because now we get to the mortals. And when gods and mortals mix, things get interesting. Very, very interesting. Let's talk about us. Humanity. Where did we come from in this grand, chaotic, and frankly overcrowded mythological world? Well, for that story, we need to turn to one of the sons of the Titan Iapetos. His name was Prometheus, and his name meant forethought.
He was clever, you see.
He thought ahead. His brother, Epimetheus, whose name meant afterthought, was not so clever. He was the kind of person who'd build a ship in a bottle and then wonder how to get it out. A lovely fellow, but you wouldn't trust him with your pin. After the Titanomachy, Zeus, in a moment of surprising delegation, tasked the two brothers with creating the creatures that would populate the earth. Epimetheus, in his usual enthusiastic but thoughtless way, got straight to work. He gave out all the best gifts to the animals. He gave them fur to keep them warm, claws and teeth for defense, wings for flight, shells for protection. He was like a child in a cosmic candy store, handing out superpowers left and right. By the time he got to the last creature, the one Prometheus had designed, he had run out of good ideas. He had a naked, defenseless, bipedal creature with no claws, no fangs, no fur, and no wings. He had created humanity, and he had left it with nothing. Prometheus, the man of forethought, looked at his poor, shivering creation, and his heart was filled with pity. He had to do something. He had to give them a fighting chance. So he went to his friend Athena, who had a soft spot for the clever Titan, and she helped him sneak into Olympus. There, from the hearth of the gods itself, or some say from the chariot of Apollo, he stole a single, glowing ember. He hid it in a hollow fennel stalk and brought it down to earth. He gave humanity the gift of fire. It was a game changer. With fire, humans could keep warm. They could cook their food, making it easier to digest and unlocking more nutrients. They could forge tools and weapons. They could see in the dark. Fire was not just a physical warmth, it was the spark of civilization, of technology, of art, of everything that would make humanity special. It was the great equalizer. Zeus was not amused. He was furious. The fire was for the gods alone. It was a symbol of their power, their separation from the mortal world. For a Titan to steal it and give it to these insignificant creatures, it was an act of defiance, an insult of the highest order. And Zeus was not a god who took insults lightly. His punishment for Prometheus was swift and terrible. He had the Titan chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. And every day, an eagle, a creature of Zeus, would fly down and eat Prometheus's liver. And every night, because he was an immortal Titan, his liver would grow back, ready to be eaten again the next day. It was an eternity of agony, a punishment designed to be as cruel and unending as possible, but Zeus wasn't finished. He wasn't just going to punish Prometheus, he was going to punish humanity as well. He was going to make them regret the day they ever saw fire. His punishment was not a flood or a famine. It was something far more subtle, far more insidious. It was a woman. He commanded Hephaestus to create a woman from clay, a creature of breathtaking beauty. Athena breathed life into her and dressed her in shimmering garments. Aphrodite gave her the gift of irresistible charm and desire. Hermes, the trickster god, gave her a cunning, deceitful mind and a shameless heart. She was a masterpiece of divine craftsmanship, a perfect, beautiful, and utterly dangerous creation. Her name was Pandora, which means all gifted. Zeus then gave Pandora a wedding gift. It was a jar or a box, depending on who you ask. It was beautifully decorated, but it was sealed tight. And he gave her one simple instruction: whatever you do, don't open this box. He then sent her down to earth as a gift to Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus. Prometheus, from his rock of eternal torment, had warned his brother, "Never accept a gift from Zeus." But Epimetheus, the man of afterthought, saw the beautiful Pandora and forgot all about his brother's warning.
He was smitten.
He took her as his wife. For a while, they were happy. But the box was always there. Pandora was consumed by curiosity. What could be inside? Why was she forbidden to open it? The thought gnawed at her, a constant, nagging itch in her mind. Finally, she could bear it no longer. When Epimetheus was out, she crept up to the box, her heart pounding. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. It was not treasure that flew out. It was a dark, buzzing cloud of all the evils of the world. Sickness, death, sorrow, poverty, war, hatred, jealousy, and every other misery you can imagine. They swarmed out of the box and spread across the earth, a plague upon humanity. Pandora, horrified, slammed the lid shut, but it was too late. All the evils were already loose. But then, she heard a tiny, fluttering sound from inside the box. She hesitated, then slowly, cautiously, lifted the lid again, and out flew a single, tiny, shimmering creature. It was Elpis, the spirit of hope. It was the only good thing in the box, the one consolation for all the suffering that had been unleashed. And it is hope, the Greeks believed, that allows humanity to endure all the evils of the world. A rather bleak and beautiful thought, isn't it? A parting gift from the gods, a little bit of light to make the darkness bearable. This was the world the mortals inherited. A world full of beauty and wonder, but also a world full of suffering and pain, a world where they were the playthings of the gods. The gods were not distant, abstract beings. They were an active and often intrusive part of daily life. They fell in love with mortals, had children with them, and just as often, they punished them for their hubris, their arrogance, their simple, human flaws. Take, for example, the story of Arachne. She was a simple peasant girl, but she was a weaver of incredible skill. Her tapestries were so beautiful, so lifelike, that people came from all over to admire her work. They said that she must have been taught by Athena herself. Arachne, who was very proud of her talent, scoffed at this. "Taught by Athena?" she said. "My skill is my own. In fact, I'm probably even better than she is." This was hubris, the sin of excessive pride, and it was something the gods would not tolerate. Athena, hearing this boast, was not pleased. She disguised herself as an old woman and went to visit Arachne. She gently warned the girl, "You are a talented weaver, my dear, but you should not compare yourself to the gods. Apologize to the goddess, and she may forgive you." Arachne just laughed. "I'm not afraid of the goddess," she said. "If she's so great, let her come and challenge me to a weaving contest. We'll see who's better." With that, Athena threw off her disguise and revealed herself in all her divine glory. "I am here," she said. "Let the contest begin." The contest was epic. Athena wove a magnificent tapestry depicting the power and majesty of the Olympian gods. She showed Poseidon creating the horse, Apollo with his lyre, and herself, winning the contest for Athens with a gift of the olive tree. It was a warning, a reminder of the power of the gods and the folly of challenging them. Arachne, for her part, wove a tapestry that was just as beautiful, but far more subversive. She depicted all the scandalous affairs of the gods, all their deceptions and their less-than-divine moments. She showed Zeus turning into a bull to abduct Europa, a swan to seduce Leda, a shower of gold to impregnate Danae. It was a masterpiece of skill, but it was also a work of profound disrespect. When she was finished, Athena looked at Arachne's work. She could find no flaw in the weaving. The skill was perfect, but the subject matter, the sheer audacity of it filled her with a divine rage. She tore Arachne's tapestry to shreds and struck the girl on the forehead. Arachne, filled with shame and terror, ran and tried to hang herself. But Athena, in a moment of what you might call pity, or perhaps just a more creative form of punishment, saved her. She turned Arachne into a spider. "You wanted to be the greatest weaver," the goddess said. "Now you and your descendants will weave for all eternity." And that, they say, is why spiders are always weaving their webs. Then there was the story of Sisyphus, a cunning and deceitful king who thought he could outsmart the gods. He was a trickster, a liar, and a murderer. His greatest crime was to cheat death not once, but twice. The first time, when Thanatos, the personification of death, came to claim him, Sisyphus asked him to demonstrate how a new set of chains worked. Thanatos, who was apparently not the brightest of primordial beings, obligingly chained himself up. Sisyphus then kept death a prisoner in his own palace. For a while, no one on earth could die.
It was a disaster.
The old and the sick suffered without end. The fates were in an uproar. Finally, Ares, the god of war, who was annoyed that his battles were no longer ending in glorious death, intervened. He freed Thanatos and handed Sisyphus over, but Sisyphus had another trick up his sleeve. Before he died, he had instructed his wife not to perform the proper funeral rites. So, when he arrived in the underworld, he went to Persephone and complained that he had been improperly sent there and needed to go back to the world of the living to arrange for his own funeral. Persephone, who was perhaps a bit too trusting, agreed. And Sisyphus, once he was back in the land of the living, had no intention of returning. He lived to a ripe old age, laughing at the gods he had tricked, but the gods have long memories. When Sisyphus finally did die of old age, his punishment was waiting for him. And it was a masterpiece of divine irony. He was condemned for all eternity to push a giant boulder up a steep hill in Tartaros. Every time he got near the top, the boulder would slip from his grasp and roll all the way back down to the bottom. And he would have to start all over again. An eternity of pointless, frustrating labor. A punishment perfectly suited to a man who thought he could cheat the natural order of things. These stories, and countless others like them, served as cautionary tales for the mortals. They were reminders of the power of the gods, of the importance of piety and humility. But they were also more than that. They were explorations of the human condition, of our own flaws and our own struggles. They were stories about pride, about love, about grief, about the eternal, unwinnable fight against death. They were the way the Greeks made sense of a world that was often chaotic, unjust, and terrifying. They were the stories they told themselves in the dark to keep the monsters at bay. And they're the stories that we are still telling thousands of years later because they still speak to something deep and true within us. They remind us that we are all, in our own way, pushing our own boulders up our own hills. And that even in the darkest of times, there is always a little bit of hope fluttering at the bottom of the box. And sometimes that's all you need. Speaking of hubris, it wasn't always about mortals challenging the gods directly. Sometimes it was about the folly of youth, the desperate need to prove oneself. And there is no better, or more catastrophic, example of this than the story of Phaeton. Phaeton was the son of Apollo, the glorious god of the sun, and a mortal woman named Clymene. Growing up, Phaeton was constantly taunted by his peers. They didn't believe he was really the son of the sun god. Prove it, they'd say, with that special cruelty that only children can muster. If Apollo is your father, why don't you go for a ride in his chariot? Phaeton, stung by their taunts and filled with a desperate need to prove his lineage, went to his mother. Clymene, seeing his distress, told him to go to the palace of the sun in the east and ask his father himself. "He will acknowledge you," she said. "He swore an oath to me by the river Styx that he would grant any wish of our child." And so, Phaeton began the long and arduous journey to the east. He traveled for months until he finally arrived at the magnificent, glittering palace of the sun. It was a place of blinding light and unbearable heat, but Phaeton, as the son of Apollo, was able to enter. There, on a throne of shimmering gold, sat his father, the sun god himself, radiating a light so bright that Phaeton had to shield his eyes. Apollo, seeing the boy, greeted him warmly. "My son," he said, his voice like the music of the spheres. "What brings you to my palace?" Phaeton, his voice trembling, told his father of the taunts, of his need for proof. "Father," he said, "if you are truly my father, grant me one wish so that all the world will know that I am your son." Apollo, his heart filled with love and pity for his mortal son, made a rash promise. "I swear by the river Styx," he said, "the most sacred and unbreakable of oaths, that I will grant you whatever you ask." Phaeton's face lit up. "Then let me drive the chariot of the sun for one day," he said. "Just for one day. That will be proof enough for everyone." Apollo's heart sank. He was horrified. He begged his son to reconsider. "My son," he pleaded, "that is the one thing I cannot grant you. The horses of the sun are no mere animals. They are fire-breathing beasts of immense power. Not even Zeus himself would dare to drive this chariot. I, and I alone, have the strength and skill to control them. The path is steep and treacherous. The sky is full of dangers. You are a mortal. You do not have the strength. Please ask for anything else. Riches, power, anything. But not this." But Phaeton was adamant. He was a teenager, filled with the reckless confidence of youth. He saw his father's warnings not as a sign of danger, but as a challenge. He accused his father of not trusting him, of not truly loving him. Apollo, bound by his unbreakable oath, was trapped. With a heavy heart, he had to agree. As the dawn approached, the great golden chariot was brought out, and the 4 fiery horses were harnessed. They were magnificent, terrifying creatures, breathing fire and stamping their hooves with impatience. Apollo gave his son some last-minute advice. "Keep to the middle path," he urged. "Not too high, or you will scorch the heavens. Not too low, or you will burn the earth. Follow the tracks of the wheels. And hold on tight." He anointed his son's face with a magic ointment to protect him from the heat, and with tears in his eyes, he watched as his son took the reins. Phaeton, his heart swelling with pride and excitement, urged the horses on. They shot up into the sky like a flaming arrow. But the horses knew at once that something was wrong. The hands on the reins were too light. The chariot was too empty. There was no master's touch to guide them. They veered off course, running wild through the heavens. Phaeton, terrified, pulled on the reins, but he did not have the strength to control them. The chariot careened wildly, dipping too low and setting the earth on fire. Mountains burned, rivers boiled, and the great forests of Africa were turned into a vast desert. The people of that land had their skins scorched black, and so it remains to this day. Then the chariot soared too high, threatening to set the heavens themselves ablaze. Gaia, the earth, cried out in agony. Her skin was cracking, her waters were turning to steam. She appealed to Zeus, the king of the gods, to do something before the entire cosmos was consumed in flames. Zeus, seeing the destruction, knew he had no choice. With a heavy heart, he hurled his mightiest thunderbolt at the runaway chariot. Phaeton, his hair on fire, was struck from the sky. He fell like a shooting star, down, 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 until his burning body plunged into the river Eridanus. His sisters, the Heliades, the daughters of the sun, were so consumed by grief that they stood on the banks of the river, weeping for their lost brother. They wept for so long that the gods took pity on them and turned them into poplar trees. And their tears, which continued to fall, hardened into amber. Apollo, heartbroken, mourned his son for days, and the world was plunged into darkness until he was finally persuaded to take up the reins of the sun chariot once more. It was a tragic tale of a father's love and a son's pride, a fiery reminder that some powers are not meant for mortal hands. Not all interactions between gods and mortals ended in such spectacular disaster. Some were tales of profound love, of a beauty so great that it could charm the gods themselves. Such was the story of Cupid and Psyche. Psyche was a mortal princess, the youngest of 3 sisters, and she was so breathtakingly beautiful that people began to neglect the worship of Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty herself. They said that this mortal girl was even more beautiful than the goddess. Aphrodite, as you can imagine, was not pleased. Her vanity was wounded, her temples were empty. She decided that this upstart mortal had to be punished. She called her son, Cupid or Eros in the Greek, the mischievous god of love, who flew about on golden wings, shooting arrows of desire into the hearts of gods and mortals alike. "My son," she said, "I want you to go down to the mortal world and find this Psyche. I want you to use your arrows to make her fall in love with the most vile, hideous, and despicable creature you can find. I want her beauty to be wasted on a monster." Cupid, ever the obedient son, agreed. He flew down to earth, his quiver full of arrows. He found Psyche sleeping in her bed, and he was stunned by her beauty. She was even more lovely than he had imagined. As he leaned over her, ready to graze her with his arrow, he was so captivated that he stumbled and accidentally pricked himself with his own arrowhead. And in that instant, the god of love fell hopelessly in love with the mortal girl he was supposed to curse. He couldn't bring himself to carry out his mother's orders. Instead, he made Psyche invisible to all mortal suitors. Her 2 older sisters, who were merely beautiful, not divinely so, both married kings. But Psyche, the most beautiful of all, remained alone. Her parents were distraught. They consulted the oracle of Apollo, who gave them a terrifying prophecy. Psyche was not destined for a mortal husband. She was to be dressed in funeral clothes and left on a mountaintop, where she would be claimed by a dreadful, monstrous serpent that even the gods feared. Her parents were heartbroken, but they dared not defy the oracle. With much weeping and wailing, they led their daughter to the mountaintop and left her there to meet her fate. Psyche, alone and terrified, waited for the monster to appear. But instead of a monster, a gentle wind, Zephyrus, the west wind, lifted her up and carried her down into a beautiful, peaceful valley. There, she found a magnificent palace, a place of such splendor that it could only have been built for a god. The doors were open and a voice whispered on the wind, "This is all for you. Enter and be not afraid." Psyche entered the palace and found it empty, but it was filled with every luxury she could imagine. A feast was laid out for her, and invisible servants attended to her every need. That night, as she lay in her magnificent bed, her mysterious husband came to her in the darkness. She could not see him, but his voice was gentle and his touch was loving. He told her that he would be her husband, that he would love her and provide for her, but she must never, ever try to see his face. If she did, he would be forced to leave her forever. Psyche, who was lonely and had been expecting a monster, was overjoyed. She agreed to his terms. And so, a strange and beautiful life began for her. Every night, her husband would come to her in the darkness, and they would talk and laugh and love. Every day, she would be alone in the magnificent palace, with only the voices of her invisible servants for company. For a while, she was happy, but she grew lonely. She missed her family. She begged her husband to allow her sisters to visit her. Her husband, with a heavy heart, agreed. "But be warned," he said. "Your sisters do not have your best interests at heart. They will try to poison your mind. Do not listen to them. And above all, do not break your promise to me." Psyche's sisters were brought to the palace by the west wind. At first, they were overjoyed to see their sister alive and well. But when they saw the splendor of her palace, their joy turned to a bitter, consuming jealousy. They couldn't bear that their younger sister, who they had always pitied, was living in such luxury. And when Psyche admitted that she had never seen her husband's face, they saw their chance. "He must be a monster," they hissed. "The monster from the prophecy. That's why he hides in the darkness. He's fattening you up, and one day, he will devour you. You must see him. You must kill him before he kills you." They gave her a plan. That night, she was to hide a lamp and a sharp knife by her bed. When her husband was asleep, she was to light the lamp, look upon his face, and if he was a monster, she was to plunge the knife into his heart. Psyche was torn. She loved her husband, but her sister's words had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. The fear and curiosity were too much to bear. That night, she did as her sisters had told her. When her husband was sound asleep, she lit the lamp and, with the knife in her hand, she crept towards the bed. She held the lamp aloft, her hand trembling, and looked. He was no monster. He was the most beautiful being she had ever seen. It was Cupid, the god of love himself, his golden wings folded at his back, his bow and arrows lying beside him. Psyche was so overcome with love and relief that she stumbled. A drop of hot oil from the lamp fell onto Cupid's shoulder. He awoke with a cry of pain and saw his wife, standing over him with a lamp and a knife. He saw the betrayal in her eyes, the broken promise. With a look of profound sorrow, he said, "Love cannot live where there is no trust." And he flew out the window and disappeared into the night. Psyche was devastated. The palace and all its splendors vanished, and she found herself alone on a desolate rock. She wandered the earth, searching for her lost love, her heart broken. She decided to go to Aphrodite, to beg for her forgiveness and her help. But Aphrodite was still furious. She had not forgotten the insult to her beauty, and she was enraged that her own son had defied her and fallen in love with the mortal girl. She decided to make Psyche suffer. She gave Psyche a series of impossible tasks, each one designed to be more difficult and humiliating than the last. First, she was to sort a huge pile of mixed grains, wheat, barley, millet, poppy seeds, into separate piles by nightfall. Psyche, overwhelmed, just sat and wept. But a colony of ants, taking pity on her, came and sorted the grains for her. Aphrodite was furious that she had succeeded. Next, she was to gather a hank of golden wool from a flock of fierce, man-eating sheep. A reed by the riverbank whispered to her not to approach the sheep during the day, when they were at their most aggressive, but to wait until evening, when they would have snagged their golden fleece on the briar bushes. Psyche did as the reed advised and completed the task. Then, she was to fill a crystal flask with water from the river Styx, which cascaded down a high, inaccessible cliff, guarded by dragons. This time, an eagle of Zeus, remembering that Cupid had once helped him, came to her aid. It snatched the flask from her hand, flew up to the waterfall, and returned with it full. Finally, for her last and most dangerous task, Aphrodite gave Psyche a small box and told her to go down to the underworld. She was to ask Persephone, the queen of the dead, to fill the box with a little of her beauty, as Aphrodite had used up some of her own while nursing her wounded son. It was a suicide mission. No mortal could journey to the underworld and return. Psyche, in despair, climbed a high tower, intending to throw herself off. But the tower itself spoke to her, telling her how to find the entrance to the underworld, how to appease the three-headed dog Cerberus with honey cakes, and how to pay the ferryman Charon to take her across the river Styx. And it gave her one crucial warning. Whatever you do, do not open the box. Psyche followed the tower's instructions and managed to complete the perilous journey. She got the box from Persephone and made her way back to the world of the living. But as she neared the end of her journey, she was overcome by a fatal curiosity and a bit of vanity. She thought, if I put a little of this divine beauty on my own face, perhaps my husband will love me again. She opened the box, but the box did not contain beauty. It contained a deep, death-like sleep. Psyche collapsed on the path, as if dead. But Cupid, who had finally recovered from his wound and had been searching for his lost love, found her. He gently wiped the sleep from her face and put it back in the box. He woke her with a gentle prick of his arrow. "You foolish girl," he said, his voice full of love. "You almost died from curiosity again." Cupid, realizing that he could not live without her, flew to Olympus and went directly to Zeus. He told the king of the gods the whole story and begged him to intervene. Zeus, who had a soft spot for young lovers and was perhaps amused by the whole situation, agreed. He called a council of the gods and announced that Cupid and Psyche were to be officially married. He gave Psyche a cup of ambrosia, the drink of the gods, making her immortal. Even Aphrodite had to accept the marriage. Psyche, the mortal girl who had suffered so much, was now a goddess, united with her love for all eternity. And in time, they had a daughter, whose name was Voluptas, or Pleasure. It was a happy ending, a rare and beautiful thing in the world of Greek myths, a testament to the power of love to overcome even the wrath of a goddess. A reminder that even after all the evils have flown out of the box, hope and love remain. And sometimes that is more than enough. Of course, not all love stories, even those involving gods, ended so happily. Some were tales of unrequited love, of passion that was not returned, of a love so all-consuming that it led to nothing but fading away. And there is no sadder or stranger example of this than the story of Echo and Narcissus. Echo was a mountain nymph, an Oread, and she was a chatterbox. She loved to talk, and talk, and talk. She had a story for every occasion, an opinion on every subject. She could talk the leaves off the trees. And for a while, this was a useful talent. She became a favorite of Zeus, who would often use her to distract his wife, Hera, while he was off having one of his many, many affairs. Echo would engage the queen of the gods in endless, pointless conversation, giving Zeus enough time to finish his business and sneak back to Olympus undetected. But Hera was no fool. It didn't take her long to figure out what was going on. And when she did, her rage was immense. But she didn't punish Zeus. That was a losing battle. Instead, she turned her wrath on the poor, talkative nymph who had aided him. "You have used your voice to deceive me," Hera said, her voice cold as ice. "From now on, you will have no voice of your own. You will only be able to repeat the last words of others." And with that, Echo was cursed. She could no longer start a conversation, no longer express her own thoughts or feelings. She could only echo the words of those around her. It was a cruel and ironic punishment for someone who loved to talk so much. Heartbroken and ashamed, Echo retreated from the company of her fellow nymphs and wandered the lonely forests and mountains. And it was there that she saw him, Narcissus. He was a young man of such breathtaking beauty that everyone who saw him, man or woman, nymph or mortal, fell instantly in love with him. He was the son of a river god and a nymph, and he had been blessed with a face that was a work of art. But he had also been cursed with a heart of stone. He was proud, arrogant, and utterly incapable of loving anyone but himself. He treated his many admirers with scorn and contempt, breaking hearts wherever he went. Echo, seeing him, was instantly smitten. She had never seen anyone so beautiful. She fell hopelessly, desperately in love with him. She followed him through the woods, her heart aching with a love she could not express. She longed to speak to him, to tell him how she felt, but her curse made it impossible. All she could do was wait for him to speak first. One day, Narcissus, who had become separated from his hunting companions, called out, "Is anyone here?" And Echo, her heart leaping, replied, "Here." Narcissus looked around, confused.
"Come," he called.
And Echo, overjoyed, replied, "Come." Narcissus, still seeing no one, called out, "Why do you run from me?" And Echo, her heart breaking, could only repeat, "Run from me." Finally, he shouted, "Let us meet." And Echo, thinking this was her chance, her moment, repeated his words, "Let us meet," and stepped out from behind the trees, her arms open, ready to embrace him. Narcissus looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. He recoiled, as if she were a snake. "Hands off," he sneered. "I would rather die than let you have me." And all Echo could do, her face burning with shame and her heart shattered into a million pieces, was whisper, "Have me." She turned and fled, hiding herself in the deepest caves and loneliest valleys. She was so consumed by her grief and her unrequited love that she stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She simply wasted away, her body growing thin and frail, until all that was left of her was her voice. A sad, lonely voice that can still be heard in the mountains and the canyons, forever repeating the last words of others. But the gods do not take kindly to such cruelty. Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, heard the prayers of the many lovers Narcissus had scorned, and she decided that he must be punished. She led him to a quiet, secluded pool of water, a pool so clear and still that it was like a perfect mirror. Narcissus, who was thirsty from his hunting, knelt down to drink. And as he did, he saw his own reflection. He had never seen his own face before, and he was captivated. He was stunned by the beauty of the face looking back at him. He fell instantly, hopelessly, and tragically in love with his own reflection. He could not tear himself away. He lay by the side of the pool, whispering words of love to the beautiful face in the water, trying to kiss the lips that were so close, yet so impossibly far away. He forgot to eat, forgot to sleep. He was consumed by a love that could never be returned. He was experiencing the same torment that he had inflicted on so many others. He called out to the woods, "Is there anyone who has ever loved so hopelessly?" And a voice, a sad, familiar voice, replied, "Hopelessly." He slowly wasted away, his life consumed by his impossible love. As he lay dying, he looked at his reflection one last time and whispered, "Farewell, dear boy, beloved in vain." And the voice of Echo whispered back, "In vain." And so, he died, a victim of his own vanity. When the nymphs came to bury him, they could not find his body. But in its place, by the side of the pool, a new flower had grown, a beautiful, white and gold flower, with its head bent towards the water, as if still gazing at its own reflection. And they called it the Narcissus. It's a sad story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of vanity and the pain of unrequited love. But it's also a story about the strange and beautiful ways that the world is shaped by our passions, our sorrows, our very human flaws. The world of the Greeks was a world alive with stories, a world where every mountain, every river, every flower had a tale to tell. Even a simple echo was a ghost, a memory of a love that could not be spoken. And what of the love of things? The love of wealth, of gold, of riches beyond the dreams of avarice? Well, for that, we have the story of King Midas. Midas was a king of Phrygia, and he was a very rich man. But he was not content. He was always dreaming of more. More gold, more treasure. He loved gold more than anything else in the world. He loved the way it looked, the way it felt, the way it shone. He spent hours in his treasury, running his fingers through his piles of gold coins, as if they were the hair of a lover. One day, some of his guards found a drunken old satyr sleeping in his rose garden. Satyrs, as you know, are wild creatures of the forest, half man, half goat, known for their love of wine and revelry. This particular satyr was Silenus, the teacher and foster father of the god Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and divine madness. Midas, who was a hospitable man, recognized the old satyr and treated him not as a trespasser, but as an honored guest. He feasted him for 10 days and 10 nights, and then personally escorted him back to Dionysus. Dionysus was overjoyed to have his old teacher back, safe and sound. He was so grateful to Midas that he offered to grant the king any wish he desired. Midas, his eyes gleaming with greed, did not hesitate. "Grant me," he said, "that whatever I touch shall turn to gold." Dionysus, who was a wise god despite his wild reputation, tried to warn him. "Are you sure?" he asked. "That is a dangerous wish. There are better things to wish for." But Midas was insistent. He could think of nothing better. And so, with a sigh, Dionysus granted his wish. Midas was ecstatic. He could hardly wait to try out his new power. He reached out and touched a twig on an oak tree. It turned instantly to gold. He picked up a stone from the path. It became a golden nugget. He plucked an apple from a tree. It became a solid gold apple, beautiful, but utterly inedible. He was overjoyed. He went back to his palace, his mind reeling with the possibilities. He would be the richest man in the world. Everything he owned would be made of pure, shining gold. He commanded his servants to prepare a magnificent feast to celebrate. But when he sat down to eat, the horror of his gift began to dawn on him. He picked up a piece of bread, and it turned to a hard, golden lump in his hand. He tried to take a sip of wine, but as his lips touched the cup, the wine turned to molten gold, searing his mouth. He was surrounded by a feast fit for a king, but he was starving. He was the richest man in the world, but he was going to die of hunger and thirst. And his despair, his beloved daughter came to comfort him. She threw her arms around him, and in an instant, she was no longer a living, breathing girl, but a cold, lifeless golden statue. Midas screamed in horror and anguish. His beloved daughter, the one thing he loved more than gold, was gone, turned into a monument to his own greed. His gift was not a blessing, it was a curse. A terrible, golden curse. He ran from the palace, his heart broken, and went to find Dionysus. He fell at the god's feet, weeping and begging to be saved from his golden touch. "I was a fool," he cried. "I have learned my lesson. Please, take back your gift. I want nothing more to do with gold." Dionysus, who was a forgiving god, took pity on the foolish king. "Go to the river Pactolus," he said. "Wash yourself in its waters, and your curse will be washed away." Midas did as he was told. He plunged himself into the river, and as he did, the golden touch left him. He was free, and from that day on, the sands of the river Pactolus were filled with gold. Midas, having learned a very valuable lesson about the true nature of wealth, gave up his kingdom and went to live in the countryside. He became a worshipper of Pan, the god of the wild, of shepherds and flocks. But it seems that Midas had a talent for getting into trouble with the gods. One day, he stumbled upon a musical contest between Pan and Apollo. Pan, with his rustic pipes, played a wild, earthy tune. Apollo, with his golden lyre, played a melody of such divine beauty that the very mountains seemed to listen. The judge of the contest, the mountain god Molus, declared Apollo the winner. Everyone agreed with the judgment. Everyone, that is, except Midas. "I thought Pan's music was better," he said, with the kind of stubborn foolishness that seemed to be his trademark. Apollo was not amused. He had already dealt with one foolish mortal's opinion on music, and he was not about to tolerate another. He strode over to Midas. "You have the ears of an ass," he said, and with a touch he made it so. Midas's ears grew long and hairy, the ears of a donkey. Midas was horrified. He was a king, even if he was a retired one. He couldn't be seen with the ears of an ass. He tried to hide them under a large turban, but he couldn't hide them from his barber. He swore the barber to secrecy, threatening him with death if he ever told a soul. The barber, terrified, promised he would never tell. But the secret burned inside him. It was too good, too juicy, to keep to himself. He was bursting with the need to tell someone. Finally, he couldn't bear it any longer. He went out into a meadow, dug a hole in the ground, and whispered the secret into the earth. "King Midas has ass's ears." Then he filled the hole and went away, feeling much relieved, but a secret, once spoken, has a life of its own. A bed of reeds grew up from that spot, and whenever the wind blew, the reeds would whisper to each other and to anyone who would listen, "King Midas has ass's ears. King Midas has ass's ears." And so, the secret was out. And Midas, the king who had learned the hard way that gold is not the most precious thing in the world, had to learn another lesson, that some secrets can't be buried, and that it's generally a bad idea to argue with the god of music, especially when he's holding a golden lyre and has a history of being a sore winner. It's a funny old world, isn't it? Even when you're trying to be humble, your past and your ears can come back to haunt you. Let us turn our gaze to the island of Crete, ruled by the powerful king Minos. Minos was another son of Zeus, born from the god's affair with the Phoenician princess Europa, whom he had abducted in the form of a white bull. Minos was a powerful and just king, but he had a dark secret in his palace. A monstrous secret. His wife, Queen Pasiphae, had been cursed by Poseidon to fall in love with a magnificent white bull. Her unnatural passion led to the birth of a monstrous creature, the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. It was a creature of immense strength and savagery, and it fed on human flesh. Minos, horrified and ashamed, needed a way to contain the monster. He summoned the greatest inventor and craftsman of the age, a man named Daedalus. Daedalus was a genius, a man who could build statues that moved and breathed, a man who could create wonders that blurred the line between art and life. Minos commanded him to build a prison for the Minotaur, a prison from which it could never escape. And so, Daedalus built the labyrinth. It was a masterpiece of architecture, a bewildering maze of twisting passages and dead ends, so complex that even Daedalus himself could barely find his way out. The Minotaur was imprisoned in the center of the labyrinth, and every year, the city of Athens, which had been conquered by Minos, was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women as a tribute to be sacrificed to the monster. Daedalus had done his job too well. King Minos, fearing that the secret of the labyrinth might be revealed, refused to let Daedalus leave the island. The great inventor, the man who had built a prison for a monster, was now a prisoner himself, along with his young son, Icarus. Daedalus looked out at the sea, which was patrolled by Minos's powerful navy.
He looked up at the sky.
Minos may control the land and the sea, he said, but he does not control the air. And so, the great inventor set to work on his most audacious invention yet. He began to gather feathers, from the smallest sparrow to the largest eagle. He bound them together with thread and wax, arranging them in overlapping rows, creating 2 great pairs of wings, modeled on the wings of a bird. It was a work of genius, a desperate, brilliant plan for escape. He fitted the smaller pair of wings to his son, Icarus, and the larger pair to himself. "Now listen to me, my son," he said, his voice full of a father's love and fear. "We will fly, but you must be careful. Do not fly too low, or the dampness from the sea will weigh down your wings. And do not fly too high, or the heat from the sun will melt the wax. Follow me, and do not stray from the path." Icarus, his eyes wide with excitement, promised to obey. They stood on the edge of a cliff, the wind ruffling their man-made wings. Daedalus, his heart trembling, kissed his son, a kiss he would never give again. And then they leaped into the air, and they flew. It was a miracle, a man and a boy, soaring through the sky like birds. Fishermen and shepherds on the ground looked up in amazement, thinking they were gods. Daedalus led the way, his heart a mixture of terror and exultation. He looked back at his son, who was flying behind him, laughing with the sheer joy of it all. But Icarus, like so many young men before and since, was overcome by the thrill of his newfound freedom. He forgot his father's warnings. He began to soar higher and higher, climbing towards the sun. He wanted to feel the heat, to touch the heavens. He was intoxicated by the power of flight. And then the inevitable happened. The sun, the great, fiery chariot of Apollo, drew closer. The wax that held the feathers together began to soften, to melt. The feathers loosened, falling away one by one. Icarus flapped his arms, but there was nothing to catch the air.
He
was no longer a bird. He was just a boy falling from the sky. He cried out for his father, but it was too late. He plunged into the sea and was drowned. Daedalus heard his son's cry and looked back. He saw the feathers floating on the water. He circled, his heart broken, and saw his son's body washed up on the shore of a nearby island. He landed and buried his son, weeping for the boy whose ambition and youthful recklessness had led him to his death. He named the island Icaria in his son's memory, and the sea into which he fell is still called the Icarian Sea. Daedalus, the great inventor, the man who had dared to conquer the sky, flew on to Sicily, a broken man. He had escaped his prison, but he had lost his son. He had flown too close to the sun, and he had been burned. It is a story that has echoed through the ages, a timeless warning about the dangers of hubris, of overreaching ambition. But it is also a story about the human spirit, about our eternal desire to break free from our limitations, to soar to new heights. It is a story about the tragic, beautiful, and often fatal dance between the dreams of the father and the passions of the son. And what of the love that dares to challenge death itself? For that, we must turn to the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was the son of a Thracian king and the muse Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. He was the greatest musician and poet who ever lived. When he sang and played his lyre, the world itself seemed to stop and listen. Rivers would pause in their courses, wild beasts would lie down at his feet, and the very trees would bend their branches to hear his music. His music was magic. It was the sound of creation itself. Orpheus was in love with a beautiful nymph named Eurydice. They were married, and their love was as perfect and as beautiful as Orpheus's music. But their happiness was short-lived. On their wedding day, Eurydice was wandering in a meadow with her bridesmaids when she was spotted by a satyr, who was filled with a sudden, brutish lust. She fled from him, and in her haste, she stepped on a venomous snake. The snake bit her on the heel, and she died in the meadow, her name a half-whispered word on her lips. Orpheus's grief was a terrible, all-consuming thing. The world, which had once been so full of music and beauty, was now silent and gray. He could not eat, could not sleep. His lyre lay untouched. He could not accept that she was gone. And so, the greatest musician in the world decided to do the impossible. He would go down to the underworld and bring his beloved back from the dead. He journeyed to the entrance of the underworld, and with his lyre in his hand, he began to sing. He sang a song of his love for Eurydice, of his grief at her loss. The music was so beautiful, so full of sorrow and longing, that the grim guardians of the underworld were moved. Charon, the grim ferryman, who had never taken a living soul across the Styx, ferried him across for free. Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell, laid down and whimpered, his three tails wagging. The very souls of the dead wept to hear his song. The Furies themselves, the goddesses of vengeance, shed their first and only tears. He came at last to the throne of Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead. He stood before them and sang his plea. He sang of the briefness of their love, of the cruelty of her fate. He did not ask for her to be spared death forever. He only asked for her to be loaned back to him, to live out their lives together. And when their time was done, they would both return to the underworld, to be ruled by Hades for all eternity. The music was so powerful, so full of love and sorrow, that even the cold heart of Hades was moved. Persephone, who knew the pain of being separated from the world of light, wept for the young lovers. Hades agreed to let Eurydice return to the world of the living. But there was one condition. Orpheus was to walk ahead of her, and he was not to look back. Not once. Not until they were both safely back in the sunlight. If he looked back, she would be lost to him forever. Orpheus, his heart filled with a desperate hope, agreed. He thanked the Lord and Lady of the Dead and turned to leave. He could hear her footsteps behind him, a faint, ghostly sound in the silent darkness of the underworld. The journey back was an agony of suspense. He longed to turn, to see her face, to make sure she was really there. But he remembered the warning, and he kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He walked through the darkness, up the steep, winding path that led back to the world of the living. He could see the light ahead, a faint glimmer that grew brighter and brighter. He stepped out into the sunlight, his heart soaring. He had done it. He had conquered death itself. And in his joy, in his desperate need to see his beloved, he forgot the warning. He turned to embrace her. He looked back. She was there, just a step behind him, her hand outstretched. But she was still in the shadow of the cave, not yet in the full light of the sun. For a single, heartbreaking moment, their eyes met. And then she began to fade. She was pulled back into the darkness, a silent, sorrowful look on her face. She whispered a single word, farewell, a word that was more a breath than a sound. And then she was gone. He had lost her. He had lost her forever, at the very threshold of life, because of a single, human moment of doubt and impatience. He tried to go back, to re-enter the underworld, but this time the way was barred. Sharon would not take him. Cerberus snarled and snapped. His music had lost its power. He sat on the banks of the river Styx for 7 days, weeping and singing his grief to the uncaring darkness. But it was no use. She was gone. He returned to the world of the living, a broken man. He forsook the company of all other women, his heart belonging only to the memory of his lost love. He wandered the wild places of Thrace, singing his songs of sorrow to the rocks and the trees. His music was sadder now, but no less beautiful. It was the music of loss, of a love that had defied death and had been defeated by a single, backward glance. His end was a tragic one. A band of Maenads, the wild, drunken female followers of Dionysus, came upon him in the forest. They were in the throes of a Dionysian frenzy, and they were enraged that he had scorned them, that he would not join in their wild revels. They fell upon him, and in their madness, they tore him limb from limb. His head and his lyre were thrown into the river Hebrus. And as they floated down to the sea, his head continued to sing a sad, beautiful song of his love for Eurydice. His limbs were gathered by the Muses and buried at the foot of Mount Olympus, where the nightingales are said to sing more sweetly than anywhere else in the world. It is a story that breaks the heart, a story of a love so powerful that it could charm the gods of the underworld, but not powerful enough to overcome a moment of human weakness. It is a story that reminds us that some things, once lost, can never be regained. And it is a story that tells us that even in the face of the greatest loss, there is still music. There is still beauty. There is still the song. And sometimes, the saddest songs are the most beautiful of all. They are the songs that remind us of what it means to be human, to love, to lose, and to sing in the darkness. And so, as the night deepens and the stars begin to fade, we leave our gods and our heroes, our monsters and our nymphs. We leave them to their eternal dramas, their loves and their losses, their triumphs and their tragedies. We leave them in their world of myth, a world that is both beautiful and terrifying, a world that is so very different from our own, and yet so very much the same. For in these stories, in these ancient tales of gods and mortals, we see ourselves. We see our own struggles, our own passions, our own foolishness, our own courage. We see our own capacity for great love and for great cruelty, for breathtaking creation and for heartbreaking destruction. We see the eternal, unchanging landscape of the human heart. And so, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you will dream of these ancient tales. Perhaps you will dream of flying too close to the sun, of a love that can conquer death, of a world where the gods walk among us, for better or for worse. And perhaps in those dreams you will find a little bit of magic, a little bit of wonder, a little bit of the music of the spheres. And you will remember that even in the darkest of nights, there is always a story to be told. And a new day, a new story, waiting to begin.
Good night.